When I was on my way to begin the process of going through ordination, there was a book that one of my mentors gave me, and it is this one right here that is called The Ultimate Intention. The cover is not much of a looker, and this is actually not even the first one that I read. The first one I read was published in the late 60s, and it looked like it was from the late 60s. But what's in this book is actually this really, really cool thought. It's called The Ultimate Intention because it starts out really setting the stage for what it means to exist, like what it means to be a believer in this faith that surrounds absolutely everything that you know of. Let me put it to you this way. Where do you think the story of Christianity really starts? Like if you were to say, where does Christianity really begin, then what would your response be? And what the author, Devern Fromke, brings up here is that there's basically 4 different categories so you can kind of put people in. You know, some people look at the resurrection and they say that is where the real relevant story of Christianity really begins. But if you do that, what that really means is that your concept of God doesn't exist or have any relevance unless sin exists. And that's kind of weird. That makes it sound like God is dependent on sin to have some kind of sense of purpose. So it can't be that. So other people will say, well, it begins with the coming of Christ. And if you say that the story of Christianity begins with the coming of Christ, then you're kind of ignoring the fact that Christ is not something that just kind of started existing with the virgin birth. You know, the coming of Christ is something that, as you read in the beginning of John, was kind of always a part of this plan built into creation. In the beginning of the Word, and the Word became flesh. And that's how we begin looking at Jesus Christ existing well before anything that begins at Matthew chapter 1. So then a third category of people will start to really get it a little bit more right. And they'll say, well, of course, the story of Christianity starts at the beginning of the Bible. It starts at Genesis 1:1. But even this is a little bit off because you see Genesis 1:1 begins the story of physical creation as we know it. And if we sit here and assume that our concept of God, the God that defines who we are, that gives us a sense of purpose and meaning and everything, is a God that doesn't really have meaning or purpose without physical creation, then that means God created everything because he needed it to give him purpose. Well, what Devern Fromke brings up that is kind of a big thought, I mean, this is a big complex thing, is that God has existed for all of eternity, which is really hard for us to understand. He's existed kind of outside of time, and for time, as long as this existed, and outside of time and everything, God is glorious. He's always been glorious. And so the reality is that our God begins before Genesis 1:1, and everything after Genesis 1:1 in the Bible, all the way through Revelation, and even to this day, is about God's demonstration of his glory. And it may sound like that makes God an egotistical individual, but I want you to kind of stop and just think about it for a split second. I mean, if God is perfect, then shouldn't God be all about his own glory? I mean, if God is perfect and God, the perfect God, is going to be oriented towards perfect things, then God would be consumed with his own glory. And the reason why this is all relevant to us is because it starts defining who we are. When you start looking at the Bible, you can see evidence of the fact that creation is a testament of God's glory. You can see evidence, something that you'll read in your small groups here in a second, that whenever people come up to Jesus and the Pharisees will tell him and say, you need to tell people to stop worshiping you. He'll say, the stones themselves will cry out and worship me. He's not saying stones are sentient. He's saying that the existence of these things being here are a form of worship of God. And so that becomes an even bigger thought when you consider the fact that we are creating in God's own image. That in Genesis 1:27, it says that we are created as a reflection of God. And if the purpose of all creation is to demonstrate God's glory, and even more so that we are built in the image of God, then it's important to understand that your sense of purpose isn't based on a mission or an individual calling. It's not based on a pursuit or on a set of strengths or weaknesses or anything like that. Your purpose is to be an instrument for God to display His very glory. How big of a thought is that? And how much bigger does that make God seem than what some people make Him out to be in their spiritual walk? Okay, so I know some of that was a little bit complex, a little bit abstract. I mean, that was actually one of the things that when my mentor gave me this book, he actually used the phrase and said, you know what, Joseph, I think you're ready for Fromke. This is not very thick, but this is a dense book, and there's a lot of kind of big brain theology stuff that's in there. But this has a very practical application to our own lives. I want you to think about this. What drives the things that you do? Typically, it's that we all have this sense of identity. We have this sense of purpose, right? And that sense of purpose actually drives how you perceive the world around you, how you make decisions on your own, like make-buy circumstances, so to speak, of, things that I'm going to do and things I don't think are bluntly worth it. Have you ever heard somebody talk about a life verse, a verse that is something that you've kind of latched onto as something for motivation? Well, I'll tell you what mine has been for many, 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 many years. And it's Philippians 1:21. And Philippians 1:21 says this, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." That can sound really extreme at first blush, but when you stop and think about what that really means, it really is the essence of an individual whose purpose is completely tied up around this idea of being the glory or reflecting the glory or demonstrating the glory of God to the world around them. That to me, I look at, my own life and I sit here and say, if you believe all this God stuff, if you believe there's a heaven and you believe that God is perfection and glory and power and all these things, then how can you not want to spend time with Him? How can you not want to be there? So to me, to die will in fact be gain. But to live while I'm here is Christ, because the purpose that we have is to be that reflection of God's own glory. This is important as we think about the things we do, but it's also important as we think about the things that we endure. Because even as we endure things around us, it can be easy to get tripped up when we just look at God as nothing more than somebody who gives us things to do. If I simply look at God and religion as something that gives me tasks I need to accomplish, then as soon as I have other things in my life that get in the way, I'm going to be willing to compromise. But that changes dramatically as soon as I start seeing that my simple, mere purpose of even being here at all is to demonstrate God's glory. I'll give you one quick little anecdote before you go back into your small groups. When I was at an event, I remember hearing a testimony from an individual that was severely disabled. And this individual was explaining how when she was in high school, she had a bunch of people that would, basically just make her feel like she really was worthless because she was so severely disabled that, her parents would have to take care of her, her whole life. And, she couldn't really get around without the assistance of a lot of, equipment and everything. And so she had actually resolved that she would go home and commit suicide. But in the midst of this pivotal point in her life when she could have made a horrible decision, she ended up reaching out to one of her youth leaders. And when she did that, this youth leader went through and started reading a story about Christ who was looking at a blind individual and was being asked, well, who did sin because this, resulting in this individual being blind? Is it that the person sinned or somebody in their family sinned? That was the thinking back then. And Christ said, neither this individual nor their family sinned. This individual was blind so that my glory might be displayed through them. And this girl reasoned in that moment that if God's glory can be demonstrated through this blind individual, that maybe the reason why I am afflicted with so many things is so that God's glory can be demonstrated through me. That is the power of a perspective on life that comes from saying, I'm not defined by physically who I may appear to be. I'm not defined by the decisions even that I've made. I'm defined by this sense of purpose that is something that is so much bigger than we could possibly understand. And it's that sense of purpose that permits me to be able to endure even the greatest hardships, the deepest hurts, and the largest challenges. On Fridays, we have a Bible group that's started at Sean and Corinne Robertson's. And last night, which was Friday night, I made the comment to the group that some people have this tendency to look at God as somebody that doesn't really do anything more but do good in the lives of other individuals. That, God would only be a good God if God didn't subject me to different challenges in life, that I never had to experience a tragedy. After all, how could a loving God expect me to have to go through those types of things? And the comment that I made to the group was that that's not a God, that's a genie. If the only purpose in your God is to be this powerful entity that ensures you never have to endure any kind of tragedy, that is you wanting your own personal genie. A God is not bound according to what you want or what I want. We may desire to have comfort and pleasure and success and wealth and all these different things in our lives, but there is a greater purpose. And because of sin's impact in the world, it means sometimes in order to achieve that purpose, we're going to have to go through difficult times. But we can endure those times if we remember that our endurance is not about reaching a point that one day we can be totally peachy keen, happy, and everything can be gumdrops and rainbows. The reason why we endure is because we live for a greater purpose, a purpose of being a demonstration of God's glory, so that if I go through periods of victory and success, people can look at me and say, that victory and success is only due to God's blessings in his life. But if I endure tragedy and great pain, people can see the inner joy in my life, and they can look at that not as an example of my own strength, but look at it as a testimony of the fact that God's purpose in someone's life allows them to be able to have such a sense of peace and joy even in the darkest days. Who wouldn't want a piece of that? That's the lesson that we have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.